Hi folks, hey, Roland Martin here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. You know, today I was just kind of reflecting back on the many years that I've spent in this game. You know, I've been a bass fisherman. I'm almost 85 years old now. So I've been a bass fisherman for better than 60, 70 years. And in the course of all those years, I've found that I'm a teacher. I've taught people the basics of bass fishing for 60, 70 years. And the case in point that's really a big deal is that I had a book I published the first edition in 1980. It was the Roland Martin's 101 Bass Catching Secrets. And it's basically 101 different patterns. But the thing about it is I look at it now, it's 40 years ago, and I look at it and it says, you know, these same principles hold true. No, sure, there's some changes. Yeah, I mean, there's modern electronics now with forward-facing sonar, that type of thing, that weren't available then. There are a lot of different lures that possibly I didn't use then. But if you take the standard basic lures, like the plastic worm, the topwater plugs, the spinnerbaits, they're all right here, and the same principles, exactly the same techniques apply today as they did 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. So here's the point. Learn the basics. That's it. The basics are so important, and so many people kind of sidetrack and say, I'm just going to take a shortcut. I'm going to just shortcut my way into good bass fishing. I'm going to learn forward-facing sonar, and that's all I need to do. No, that's not the case. I'm not condemning forward-facing sonar, but I'm condemning the fact that you don't have the basics of bass fishing under your belt. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, how to get the basics of bass fishing under your belt. Okay, let's open this book up. I tell you, it's so easy to find in these illustrations. Well, the secret of this book was that I had hundreds of photographs. You notice there's a photograph on about every single page, and that was the key to people when they go to read a book. They don't want to read. They look at the photograph and the caption under the photograph. That's kind of what catches their eye. So if you want to write a book that's successful and it's just have plenty of good photographs. But I started off with a lot of stuff with plastic worm fishing. And so what I said 40 or 50 years ago on plastic worms is basically the same today. You know, we use the same slip weights, we use the same Texas rig, we use the same consistency worm, and basically the same sizes and colors and shapes that they have today. And it's 100% the truth. The Carolina rig is the same today as it was many years ago. There's so many examples of that. I got photographs all over the place, just like that photograph right there with the bass. You know, that's just a regular plastic worm on a 20-pound monofilament. Now, there's things that have changed. For example, the tackle itself has changed. And so the tackle being that I now use braid more than I do, say, monofilament, because I think braid offers you a better hook setting ability. However, braid in real clear water needs a leader possibly. So we use the fluorocarbon leader, which is a new kind of thing, and fluorocarbon wasn't available back when this book was written. But we just basically had monofilament. But still, monofilament, if you want to get back to the basics, well, monofilament is a lot cheaper. And if you come down here to Santee Cooper or Okeechobee or one of these southern lakes that I grew up and cut my teeth on, you'd find that if you use a 20-pound monofilament that you could get at Walmart or Bass Pro or any of these stores for just a few bucks, it'll do the job. You know, 20-pound monofilament's a pretty stout worm complement, and it gets them out of the grass pretty well. Now, if you want some real heavy cover, yeah, and you're really going down to Mexico for a gigantic fish and you're throwing worms at really heavy cover, hey, now you need that heavy braid, that 65-pound braid like we use for our flipping techniques and our frogging techniques and some of the real ultra heavy cover deals. Now, one thing about this book is basically a premise on power fishing, because that's kind of what I do. You know, I do spinnerbaits, I do flipping, I do pitching and worming and all the really kind of heavy duty stuff, buzz baits and topwater. And I don't do so much finesse stuff. Like now with forward-facing sonar, what the people normally do is get out in the open water and take a spinning rod with 6 and 8 and 10-pound line. And it's kind of a finesse thing. It's accurate casting, little small jigs and stuff. But we've eliminated, the problem with the forward-facing sonar in my mind is that when you eliminate power fishing, you eliminate a lot of the crankbaits, a lot of the spinnerbaits, a lot of the power fishing tools and techniques that I so much love. I mean, I think it's the most important thing and the most fun thing in the world to fish a frog in the heavy grass and have a big 6 or 8 pound bass come up through the muck and grime and bust you, pulling them out over limbs and logs, and wow, that's bass fishing. Now, sure, a forward-facing sonar, you catch big fish, and it's a fun deal, following a fish and looking at it, and I enjoy it. It has its place, but it doesn't replace the power fishing that I've cut my teeth on. And so let's look at some more examples. Okay, folks, you know, there's a lot of different kind of worms that are available. And here's a worm, it's floating worm. Look at this floating worm rig. That floating worm rig, that's a deal. I'll tell you what the floating worm is. There's worms that have a lot of air injected in them. You used to be able to get them. And they'd float on top, and you'd put a light hook in there, and you'd twitch them along with a spinning rod in places like down in Florida and Salt Springs and along the St. Johns River and all these places where they're spawning over top of the eelgrass. And this worm just kind of floats. And you know, it's funny because I don't see that happening right now. Nobody's making a worm like that. And I still have those floating worms. I still do it. And I go back there when you can't actually see the bed. You just know there's eelgrass there and there's little holes in the eelgrass. And you can just kind of work your floating worm over top of that. And the bass just come up and get it like a topwater plug. And it's really, really a blast. But you might think about that. So by looking at these old techniques, these old power fishing techniques that we had, particularly in the spawning seasons, you can really find some new techniques. That floating worm is one of them. But anyway, the spawning thing, as I was talking about, is kind of controversial. And we catch and release all the fish that we catch anyhow. And the biologists say that that's perfectly all right. You're really not hurting the bass population at all if you have a real comprehensive catch and release program. You're not going to hurt it. And the fact that you displace the bass and move them from one spot to another, hey, they'll go ahead and respawn somewhere else. And so I've talked to a lot of biologists, and they all say, if you don't kill the bass and you catch and release them, you're in really good shape. Now, if it's unethical to you to fish for spawning fish, if for some reason you don't want to fish for spawning bass, then just don't fish. Here in Florida, if this were Okeechobee, they spawn a little bit in December, so don't fish in December, and January, and February, March, and April. There's some fish in May, so don't fish 6 or 7 months. You can only fish if you're that type of person that only want to catch fish that aren't spawning. Only fish June, July, August, September, and October, November. That's all you can do if that's your goal. So, because fish down here spawn almost 6 months a year. You can't see them. You're just going out there and casting to a good target, which may or may not have a bass bait on it. You're just out there just fishing those flats with a topwater buzzbait. You don't know that there's a fish spawning there, but you might catch them. So the point is, you're catching spawning bass all the time, even whether you know it or not. So when you say, I don't believe in catching spawning bass, you're catching spawning bass. You're catching spawning bass all spring. And so the point is, there's 2 different kinds of fishing for spawning bass. One where you spot them and say, okay, I'm just going to catch that fish, and you drop little worms and all sorts of gitsits and stuff into the bed. Hey, you can catch spawning bass that way. Or you can just go out and just fish just like you'd always fish, throw it into a little pocket, not knowing if there's a spawning bass there or not, but you're catching spawning bass. The point is, catch and release saves the whole day. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep this bass population up. Now, another thing a biologist told me about, and it was common knowledge years ago, and I found everybody had years ago thought that, well, we'll just keep the big ones, let the little ones grow up and be big. That's not the scenario. Now, people throw fish back, they don't eat many bass, but the point is, it goes the other way. Ray Scott, the founder of B.A.S.S, Ray Scott had the idea through a lot of other biologists that you need to eliminate some of the smaller bass. And recently, my son Scott and I went out to Arkansas, and Steve Bowman has a lake restoration project, and he builds lakes for people. He has to go in and catch these little bass and just kind of eliminate them from the system, because often the lake can only support so many pounds of fish. And so what Steve Bowman does and what Ray Scott did years was, if you want to grow big bass in a lake and have a situation with big bass, you throw all the big bass back. You never keep them, period. And it's sometimes necessary to eliminate the little bass by taking them out of the system. I know I talked to Steve Bowman the other day. He caught 137 bass out of one of the lakes that he manages because he had too many bass. To grow the really big fish, it's only going to support so many pounds of bass per acre. And so you want the big bass to grow. And if there's too many little bass, they're going to take away all the food sources, and the big bass aren't going to grow as well as if they were just fewer bass and more bait that way, and therefore it's a more well-balanced system. So always throw the big ones back. If you're going to keep a fish, keep a little one. Okay, that's the message. That's been around for a long time. Okay, spinnerbaits, that's a perfect example. You know, a spinnerbait is still a big bass lure. And I came up with the Roland Martin Big Bass spinnerbait years ago when Todd Faircloth, one of the local anglers down here in Florida, had gotten some Hildebrandt blades, the willow leaf blades, the big number 6s and number 7s. And we started taking taking spinnerbaits apart, because spinnerbaits were on the market, but nothing with the big willow leaf. And so we started taking those big number 6 blades, really big blades, and start fishing them here in Okeechobee. And guess what? Those really big spinnerbaits with the big blades catch big fish. But that's not really the way to fish a lot. I mean, I fish that way in tournaments. You know, when you have just 4 or 5 bass to catch and you're in a lake with a lot of cover, you can do that. You can just say, okay, I'm just going to try to catch 5 big fish. If that were the case, I would throw a big spinnerbait. That would be one choice. I might throw a big whopper plopper for a topwater, might be another choice. I might take a big jig and just flip the big heavy cover as another choice. But there's only a couple techniques that are really set up for really big fish. And really big fish, a big spinnerbait is one of them. A big jig is another one, of course. You know, a big topwater plug's a third one. But that's power fishing techniques. That's power fishing 101. Now I know that they're, with forward-facing sonar, they're targeting big fish as well. My son Scott can see from the tail movement of the fish that he sees on forward-facing as to, well, Dad, that's a 5-pounder, or that's a 6, or that's an 8-pounder. He can just kind of tell by looking at the fish and how it swims as to what size it is. My problem is I can't even tell what kind of fish it is. I'll say, Scott, there's a big one on the screen now. He'll say, no, Dad, that's a tilapia. No, Dad, that's a carp. No, Dad, that's a garfish. And so how do you know that? Through experience. And so the one thing about forward-facing sonar I'll have to say is that a few people, like my son Scott, are experts at it. I'm not. And so they can beat my socks off. Jacob Wheeler and guys like that, and my son can beat me every time with forward-facing sonar because they're really, really into it. But there's not that many people that are really, really into it. It takes a lot of knowledge, and it takes an expert to set your units up. See, half the time my units aren't working right. They're not adjusted right. So you really need to be an electronics expert as well as a video game expert to make forward-facing work for you. You need somebody to help you set it up. Anyway, okay, spinnerbaits. Now, one thing that's happened with spinnerbaits lately is there's now the chatterbait. And the chatterbait has kind of replaced, for a lot of anglers, the chatterbait has replaced a spinnerbait. Because spinnerbaits we used to use in, you know, buzzing over the heavy cover and covering a lot of water, making long casts, retrieving it fast. Jimmy Houston has come up with a technique of kind of bulging the water a lot of times over the grass flats. And by the way, Jimmy Houston's Redman spinnerbait's an excellent choice. I'm telling you, I'll put it on the table right next to it, the best chatterbait there in the world, because his Redman spinnerbait's a single number 4 willow leaf blade, and it casts like a really well 3/8 ounce is just perfect, and it also has a wire that's really indestructible. We've taken those Redman spinnerbaits down to Louisiana, down to say Venice, and caught those big bull redfish, and they'll bend it all up and they'll tear the blades off almost sometime, but the thing won't break. The wire won't break. It might twist up a lot, and you might even lose a blade occasionally what happens is one big redfish, 20 pounds, has a lure here, and the spinner blade is out here, and another big 20-pounder grabs grabs the spinner and then tears it off the lure. But it doesn't break the lure. You still have the fish. There's at least one of them. Anyway, that's a good choice. But the chatterbait, and that wasn't covered in this book. See, this book 50 years ago, we didn't have chatterbaits. Chatterbaits weren't available then. We were doing modifications, of course, with putting the big willow leaves on. But even today, there still is that Roland Martin Big Bass spinnerbait. If you want to catch a big fish, and you in a tournament, and all you want to do is catch 5 big fish, and it's the right kind of year where you can bump that stump, or you can run that spinnerbait over the shallow grass. If you throw that Roland Martin Big Bass spinnerbait, or at least a spinnerbait with a big blade on it, like I'm talking about, you'll catch some big fish. Whether you win the tournament or not, I don't know, but I won several good big bass tournaments on B.A.S.S trail with the big spinnerbait. So that is really a player for power fishing and big fish. And it's the same today as it was 30, 40 years ago. Okay, let's take topwater fishing. Now here's an old photograph of me with a big old 10-pound bass. It talks about that I caught a 10-pound bass on a prop bait. Well, you know, you've seen my YouTube videos. One of my favorite lures for right now is that devil's horse. Now that's a lure that I've been using for 50 or 60 years. And I'm telling you what, folks, when it comes to spawning fish today, as it did 50 or 60 years ago, you get in that little pocket and you run that little prop bait over there and just let it sit there and then the sun's shining a little bit. And as you twitch it just an inch, those blades just move just a little bit and the reflection just kind of sparkles the water. You'll see the reflection coming off those blades. And that bass, after 2 or 3 little twitches right over his bed, it's so intimidating to that bass. He just can't stand it. And the longer it stays there and the slower it is, the more intimidating it is. And it's right over his bed. Now, you don't know necessarily that little pocket in the grass has a bass spawning in it. You don't know. I'm just throwing in every little pocket I see. A little pocket, just let it sit there, a little teeny twitch. Let it sit there, a little teeny twitch. Sometimes, and it's so cool, sometimes I'll see a great big kind of a boil just coming up around the plug. I'll just see the water just kind of boiling up. And it's probably a big 6 or 8 or 10-pound bass coming right up to it. And he's just an inch from it. And you know that next little twitch is going to be either an explosion or just a suck. Sometimes these big 10-pound bass it's just sitting there, and all these big bass come up and they just suck it down. And it's just a big old fish. Anyway, that happens with a prop bait as well. The same premise is with frog fishing. Now, frog fishing has been around a long, long time. Now, we've perfected frog fishing more than we did, say, 50 years ago. We didn't have the braid, and we had tough times getting the fish out with frogs because we didn't have the tackle. Now we have stiffer rods, and we have heavier braid, and so frog fishing is more efficient today than it was back years ago when I wrote this book. But frog's the same kind of deal. You throw the frog into heavy patches of grass and you watch for that boil. You watch for that grass movement and anything like that. And the second you see it, you just stop and just be real little teeny twitches and something's going to happen. I'm guaranteeing you, that's visual action. That's power fishing 101. That's the most fun there is in bass fishing, I think, is just to see that little boil up underneath the plug and you're anticipating this great big bass, and sure enough, when you twitch it, kaboom, it is just game on. And that's bass fishing to me, more so than any other form of fishing. You know, one of the really cool deals is my pitching and flipping and my heavy duty. I've actually won more bass tournaments and had more success with a big flipping stick than I have anything. Whether I'm throwing that spinnerbait on a flipping stick or a buzzbait on a stick, even a crankbait on a flipping stick, I'm using big heavy tackle for the most part because I'm fishing basically heavy cover. I'm basically a power fisherman. But the number one thing is taking a jig or a crawl worm and pitching and flipping. Now, we talked all about that in this book and talked about how the fact that with just a jig, I was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time. One whole summer, all I did was count the number of bass I caught, and I found that with plastic worms, throwing plastic worms in little tight places, I'd catch twice as many bass. But I also found that by throwing a jig in the same spot, I'd catch half as many bass, but they were twice as big. So what would you want to do? Catch 20 bass, or catch 10 bass and have the 5 biggest for the tournament. So that's, so it was basically, I would get away from the worm fishing. Even though worm fishing produces more fish, I'd get away from it a lot of times in tournament competition, just trying to catch those 5 big fish. And it's the same today as it was then. That's still a really good power technique. Here in Okeechobee, the guys that normally win the tournaments, Gary Milicevic, guys like that are here on the lake, they're fishing mats, and they're fishing big heavy clumps of bulrushes, and they're fishing the hardline edges and the matted up places, and they're fishing it with either a jig or a crawl worm, and it produces the most fish today. It outdoes the forward-facing guys, it outdoes the worm guys, it outdoes the crankbait guys. Time and time again, pitching and flipping in the heavy matted up covers here in Okeechobee wins the tournament. Let me put my glasses on. I'm going to look at this book a little bit. I'm looking at some pictures here that I took. It was talking about current, how the current affects fish going through culverts, how the wintertime fish kind of move in a certain kind of area, all sorts of things. And all this is the same today as it was 50 years ago. The deep channels would hold winter fish. The culverts would hold the fish always facing to the current. The fact that bass can't back up, they're constantly looking forward into the current. All this is just basic knowledge. And the second you can, here's the thing: as a pattern fisherman, I put together all these techniques, and this whole book is just about a pattern. I put together that exact set of water and cover conditions that attract fish to that particular spot and other similar spots. And the whole thing is that once I identify the water clarity, the water depth, the water color, the temperature of the water, all these different factors, the proximity of good cover and structure, the weeds and cover available, and to factor all these things in, I can usually catch a fish and then identify more such spots. And that's the whole thing about pattern fishing. Once you catch a fish and you look around the area that you've caught that fish and say, well, there's this, that, and the other thing there. I just need to duplicate it and really be good at that. Look at the right water temperature and the right water clarity and think about the current. All these things are a factor, and they can be duplicated into a pattern. And that's what made me the fisherman that I am. The fact that I could put together patterns. And I know you can do it too. But the point is that this book is timeless. It's not just this book, but bass fishing is timeless. The techniques that were created, a good example, a Johnson spoon. I was fishing one time on Santee Cooper, and I caught this big bass with this guy, and I said, well, listen, isn't this cool, this Johnson spoon? And the guy told me, he says, son, I want to let you know, he says, I'm 75 years old, and this was years ago, and he said, I'm 75 years old, and I just want to tell you, the Johnson spoon was my father's favorite lure. So, I still use a Johnson spoon today. It's 150 years ago that lure was created, and yet it still works. And so there's a lot of basics to bass fishing, and that's what you need to do. Get down to the basics, learn your bass fishing, and establish that pattern, and you'll become a better bass fisherman, I guarantee. Hey, thanks for watching. Hey, hit that likes button. I tell you, we really appreciate your support, Bass Pro Shop, and all the people that it's what greases the wheel in my world. It's what makes them continue their contracts and continue having me available to do these YouTubes or television in general. So anyway, we'll see you again soon. Hey, and thanks for watching.